Just a few reasons why Rails is so wicked awesome. Just a few. I'm gonna read through these as quick as I can. I already said Ruby is joy. I wanted to make that point. I remember when I started on BASIC as a kid on the Apple II, I just loved it. And I hadn't felt that for many years. I definitely didn't feel that in .NET. But when I came back to Ruby, a dynamic language, I felt like a kid again. It was awesome. Like I'm getting tingles right now talking about it because it's like I came alive again. So even if you don't do Rails from this, try out Ruby. Ruby is great. It's an interpreted language. I mean, that's good stuff. There's no compilation. There's no compile cycle. You get a lot of better feedback when you're debugging. So that's Ruby. Rails, very strong opinions, like you said. It covers the commodity stuff. But it's also a compendium of best practices. Everyone in the community is concerned about doing this stuff right. And there's blog posts galore, and there's books galore about the Rails way, the way to do things. And it's almost as if everyone has said, all right, I played with all this stuff, but then I figured out the best way to do it, and check it out. And it becomes commoditized. In other words, the best practices become the standard practices. Those opinions save you time, focus on what's unique. And there's often, the thing about Ruby and Rails, it's very idiomatic. So if you see there's a lot of code going on, you probably don't have it right. And if you get down to something that's like 1 or 2 lines of code, it's just like, like you've got it. It's almost slotted. It's almost like it's on Rails. Nuts and bolts are covered. Dry, don't repeat yourself. That is throughout the language. Like I said before, Ruby enables a style of programming that allows you to represent either data or functionality in one and only one place, and that's solid programming. What else we got? Convention over configuration, sensible defaults. In other words, no monster config files. And if you've ever done Java or .NET, you know you can get deep into XML hell. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I'm assuming it might still be the case. You get a built-in web server that's based on Ruby, so you just start your server off the command line and you're running. You don't have to configure Apache or anything if you don't want to. A lot of code can be generated. That's good stuff, saves you time. You can actually bootstrap very quickly with the notion of scaffolding just to get you off the ground. Much like the scaffolding of a building, you're going to remove the scaffolding once you've finally worked on the facade of the building. Testing is first-class citizen in Rails. Very encouraged in the community. It's a great thing to see people testing more and more. And I think that's about it. You can take the right-hand side.
Sure. I guess one of the best things that Rails delivers when you first start getting into web development that deals with databases is that Rails delivers an ORM, an object relational mapper, and so it delivers it using the active record pattern. What this means really is that you don't have to write any SQL when you're dealing with all of your domain logic, when you're persisting data. You just talk in active record speak, which is very simple. You have an object, you add some attributes to it, and you say .save, and it persists it to the database. And query lookups are amazingly simple. Doing a join takes one hash option. It's join this model name, and you've got a SQL join. So that's kind of the beauty of dealing with Rails models. Also, you get built-in validations. You get a really robust callback system, which allows you to do many things before or after a specific action is taken. So before save, I want to send an email, and then after save, I want to update some other model and attribute. All those things are really simple to do. Database migrations are also super useful. Over time, any database schema is going to change while you're developing. And instead of having to go back and enter your database console and do all the changes manually in SQL, you do them in Ruby. And some of the best parts about that is you check in these migration files, you share your code with the rest of your team, and then they just run a command, rate db migrate, and all of a sudden all their schema is up to date with whatever your schema was. That's super helpful.
The last point on models, though, I love the fact that I don't write much direct SQL unless I have to. You can always go down to the SQL level if you need to, but mostly it's all wrapped up and abstracted in models and methods. Views. Rails supports the notion of a layout, so if you have a standard header and footer, that's all built in, so you don't have to repeat or do any sort of includes. It does support the notion of partial reuse, so a partial is just a chunk of something on a web page. And if you have standard bits of data throughout your web app, for example, you're probably going to reuse that chunk. Like if let's say you have like a store on the web and you sell antique video games. So one of your partials might be a product view that shows a little image of the video game and then some description, and you can reuse that throughout the site. And the point is all this stuff is built in. You don't have to reinvent reuse. HTML helpers, you can actually generate most of your HTML with simple Ruby calls. Like if you want to draw a link, you just say link to, and then you don't actually say link, you don't actually do an href tag. You say link to, and then you give a named route in your site. Like all that's very abstracted. You don't have to think about on the ground how the HTML is going to look, but you can always override it. Has built-in tools for building forms. So if you're putting text fields on, you're putting buttons and checkboxes, all that stuff is handled. All that stuff has helper methods to help you get that done, and it handles the state persistence for you as well. So if a checkbox was checked and it was persisted in the database, when the form comes back up, it's going to be checked again already. Ajax. Ajax is also a first-class citizen in Rails. Makes it very easy to handle all those whiz-bang things that you see, like if you submit a form and it doesn't refresh the whole page, it just refreshes that one little bit of the page that matters. All that stuff is just built right in. Caching, if you're worried about scalability, caching is built in.
So most websites are all about persisting data to your database, and for the most part, we always implement CRUD.
What's CRUD mean, Sandro?
The ability to create, restore, update, and delete resources. And so oftentimes, if you're going to make a new item in your store, you do /new, you get a form, you input the form, you post it, and then that does a create. So these are some of the elements of CRUD. And what they've done is they've mapped CRUD and REST together. And
What's
so,
REST mean, Sandro?
Representational state transfer, right? And so it's just kind of a mapping for your URLs to represent the resources in your system. Your resources are typically your models, like a store item would be a resource. And they've also mapped the HTTP verbs to REST. So if I send a post request to a given URL, then I'm sorry, maybe that's not. I'll do delete and update. If I /item/1 and I send a put request, an HTTP put, then Rails knows that I'm trying to do an update, and it pushes me off to the update action in my controller. But if I send an HTTP delete to that same exact URL, it knows that I'm trying to destroy the object, and so it pushes me off to the destroy action. So really, you get a small amount of URLs, and then based on the HTTP verb, you get routed to the correct spot in your controller, the correct action.
The only other thing I wanted to stress is it's conventional. All your URLs look the same. So you'll have /items, and that's your index. That's your read of everything. If you have /items/42, that's a read of one item. If you post to /items, that's the create command. All this stuff is handled for you. I know we're going over this quickly. It took me a while to get my head around REST, but it's the best we can do in a short time here. Let's move on. Popular sites on Rails. There was some hubbub about Twitter, but they're okay now. Yellow Pages was a big success story. Their transition to Rails. Hulu is the video site. You all know you can watch the latest videos.
The version control system that's getting a lot of popularity now is Git, and GitHub itself is it's a website that offers Git hosting and a pretty UI to all of the Git facilities that you need.
It's also very social. It's about collaboration. Git is like the successor to, I don't know, CVS, SVN, and then you had like Mercurial and Bazaar and all that. Git is a distributed source control system, and so it makes sense to put a social networking spin on it and throw it on GitHub. And there's this notion of forking where, since it's distributed, everyone can have their own repository. So when you fork, you're actually working on your own copy of the code, and you can tell the original maintainer, it's like, hey, do you want to pull my changes back in? And that's all arbitrated through the website.
It's good to know that not just the Ruby and Rails guys are using Git for version control. They've got all sorts of languages posted on their site.
Basecamp, by the way, was the first Rails site done by David Heinemeier Hansen.
Before it was Rails.
Before it was Rails. Rails was actually extracted out of a running website, and that's why it's a very useful framework, because it wasn't like, let's build a pie-in-the-sky framework, and it's going to be awesome, and it's going to solve all our problems. No, this one was actually pulled out of a running app, so it's very useful for people who want to write running apps. All right, let's get into it.